has actually a wonderful talk on this subject in, was it Blogging Theology, correct? Movie? Yeah, with Bassam. Again, an excellent presentation on the subject. If any of you have read any of his work and any of his writings, excellent. A very well-researched individual, walillah alhamd. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continue to bless him in his work and allow him to continue contributing. I have benefited extremely and a lot from him. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward him. But without further ado, inshallah, like we said, we spoke about the LGB part of the equation. He will be addressing the T and some other related issues. فليتفضل مشكورا مأجورا.
جزاك الله خير. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. So I think what's going to be useful here is to take a few steps back, and what I'm going to do is I'll spend maybe 10 minutes talking about the conceptual issues, because I think many times these are topics that people take for granted that they understand well, but we need to unpack what these concepts are and the way people employ them. And then after talking about the concepts, we'll discuss why they're challenges for us and discuss a little bit, any other things that we want to talk about. So we'll do maybe some Q&A and stuff like that. So we'll start with homosexuality itself. The term homosexuality refers to a social phenomenon, and there are 4 things that fall under that concept that tend to get amalgamated or conflated together under that term. The first thing that people are talking about when they refer to the term homosexuality is thoughts and desires. Thoughts and desires. The second thing that people are talking about when they refer to homosexuality, or that falls under the orbit of that term, are actions and behaviors. Actions and behaviors. The third thing is a lifestyle, and usually that involves a social group, the way a person participates culturally, how a person thinks about politics. And then the fourth part of that is the identity. The fourth part of that is the identity. So all 4 of those things are being spoken about at once when people talk about someone being gay or coming out of the closet or being part of a community or homosexuality as a whole. It's an undifferentiated way to talk about all 4 of those things at once. And that represents a challenge for us as Muslims, because we have to unravel each of those. Because each of those there's different moral weight that each of those carry. So when we talk about things like thoughts and desires, and I'll go through these very quickly, but when you think about thoughts and desires, we might say at the level of the Sharia, if someone has thoughts, fleeting thoughts that come into their mind, to do something that is sinful, they have a religious obligation to stifle those thoughts. Right? That's what their responsibility and duty is. And that's the duty of every Muslim. Right? That when they have thoughts that try to incline them towards sin, the Prophet ﷺ refers to as a ham bisayyi'ah, that a person has sort of this inclination towards doing a sin. If they don't do it, they don't act upon it, they actually get a reward for that. But if they act on it, if they relish in that thought, they fantasize, their sort of heart acts, that's when they begin to incur sin. And so at the level of thoughts, we might say that a person who simply has those passing thoughts, the thoughts themselves, just like any of the thoughts we have, those don't carry any negative moral connotations insofar as a person doesn't allow those thoughts to meditate, linger, or be acted upon. And that's when they become morally significant for us. Nevertheless, a person is also encouraged to try to block the means to acting on them. So not putting yourself in situations where you may be individually compromised or susceptible to acting on those thoughts. And this is a concept in the Sharia known as sadad al-riya', right, where you block the means to acting on sin. And so if there are contexts or situations where you know you're going to feel more personally inclined to sin or tempted to sin, those are avenues and places that you avoid. And there are 10 of rules in the Sharia associated with that. So khalwa, for instance, being alone in the same room with the opposite sex, or in a situation where you just really know you're sexually attracted to another person, you're alone with them, you're not supposed to do that, right? It's impermissible. And there are other rules like that. Ghadd al-basar, lowering the gaze, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, قُلْ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ يَغُضُّوا مِنْ أَبْصَارِهِمْ وَيَحْفَظُوا فُرُوجَهُم, right? To the believing men and the believing women. قُلْ الْمُؤْمِنَاتِ يَغُضُّضْنَ مِنْ أَبْصَارِهِنْ وَيَحْفَظْنَ فُرُوجَهُنْ. And both the believing men and believing women are taught to lower their gaze and guard their chastity. Likewise, the Prophet ﷺ taught us about fasting, because it helps a person learn to control his appetites. A person becomes more disciplined in his or her own life. So these are all things that exist to help us live with greater discipline vis-a-vis the base desires that we might feel. We are also taught that the idea of experiencing these desires is a type of test in this world. It's a test in this world. And this life is comprised of many tests. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, He says, الَّذِي خَلَقَ الْمَوْتَ وَالْحَيَاةَ, that He created death and life, لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ أَيُّكُمْ أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا, to test which of you would be best in deeds. So this life is a test. You're going to be tested. أَحَسِبَ النَّاسَ أَن يُتْرَكُوا, did mankind think they'd be left to say, آمَنَّا, we believe, وَهُمْ لَا يُفْتَنُونَ, and that they wouldn't be tested, So to a certain extent, we can take a step back and say people who have these sort of thoughts and inclinations, this is a test that Allah has endowed them when. Allah has endowed people with different tests in their life. Those tests are going to be more difficult or easier. Not all of them are going to be the same. Nevertheless, what we are responsible for is how we respond to those tests. And so when we're thinking about the level of thoughts and desires, someone who says, usually, and this is why unpackaging this is important, if you have a teenager in the community who comes and says, I think I'm gay, usually what that person is communicating is that he or she has thoughts and desires or feels sexually attracted to the same sex. That's usually all they're saying at that point. And they have that feeling predominantly or exclusively for people of the opposite, for the same sex. And they're saying, look, I think I'm gay as a result of those thoughts. Okay. And so what you're able to do is treat thoughts and desire as an independent category. And maybe remind a person about how thoughts and desires are viewed in the Sharia itself, especially shahawat. Right? Shahawat are things that we're taught are extremely difficult. Right? The Prophet ﷺ in a hadith, he said that the paradise, Jannah, حُفَّتِ الْجَنَّةِ بِالْمَكَارِهِ, that paradise is surrounded by things that are really difficult for people. But حُفَّتِ النَّارِ بِالشَّهَوَاتِ, but the hellfire is surrounded by temptation, by things that people have urges to do and have to meaningfully resist. And the sexual desire is one of the strongest temptations, if not the strongest temptation, any human being is going to have in this life. So it's something that we have to teach people to govern. So that's sort of the first bucket when we're starting to talk about thoughts and desires. It also means that a person who's merely experiencing those thoughts but hasn't acted on them or done anything sinful isn't sinful in the sight of Allah and has an opportunity to earn reward. That's something that we remind all Muslims of when it comes to sexual desires that they may feel. Lowering the gaze, not acting on them, behaving in a chaste and upright manner is a way of attaining status in the sight of Allah. Allah says in the Quran about the believers, وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِفُرُوجِهِمْ حَافِظُونَ, that they're those with respect to their own sexual desires, they preserve their chastity. May Allah make us from them. So that's the first category. The second category is behaviors and actions. And here we have direct moral import when a person acts on temptations that they feel. And those actions are sinful, some more sinful than others, and some are a matter of grave sin. Right? Just like zina, especially male-male sexual acts such as sodomy, that's sort of the same status. And I think Sheikh Farhan spoke about the fact that it may be, especially in the Sharia, when we talk about sodomy, is it a had punishment or ta'zir, discretionary punishment? Nevertheless, it's a grave moral sin. And so when it comes to sinning and behaving in ways that are sinful, on this we would take a step back and we'd address that in a few ways. First and foremost, we would say sins themselves, short of the sins of shirk and kufr. Right? So the sins of disbelief and associationism or polytheism don't take a person out of Islam. So a person who sins even a major sin is still a Muslim. And that's important because people are liable to sin in this world. The Prophet ﷺ said, all the children of Adam sin, وَخَيْرُ الْخَطَّائِينَ تَوَّابُونَ. But the best of those who sin are the people who repent. And so when people sin, we remind them about tawbah, about returning to Allah, about repenting. That becomes an important part of our discourse. That just because a person slipped or succumbed to their nafs or their shahawat, this doesn't have to become a defining moment for them. But rather it can be a means for them to be rehabilitated in Allah's sight. And no matter how often people sin, that door of tawbah is still open. So there's a very famous hadith of Ibn Abbas who said that radiallahu anhu, he said that a group of people came to the Prophet ﷺ and they said, we heard the message of Islam and we see good in it. And they started mentioning things that they had done in their past. They said, we used to murder people a lot. And so they were bandits. And he said that we committed zina and we did it a lot. So, just fornicating. He said, we did it a lot. And he said, is there anything in Islam for us? And Ibn Abbas said that after this, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed a few verses, including the very famous verse, قُلْ يَا عِبَادِيَ الَّذِينَ أَسْرَفُوا عَلَىٰ أَنفُسِهِمْ. Tell my slaves who have wronged themselves, لَا تَقْنَطُوا مِنْ رَحْمَةِ اللَّهِ. Don't despair from the mercy of Allah. From the mercy of Allah. إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَغْفِرُ الذُّنُوبَ جَمِيعًا. That indeed Allah forgives all sins. Allah forgives all sins. إِنَّهُ هُوَ الْغَفُورُ الرَّحِيمُ. That indeed He is the forgiving and merciful. So on sins themselves, what we say is that people can be rehabilitated from the deeds that they do, though nevertheless they should try to put themselves in situations where they don't sin. And what we warn people against, perhaps most strongly, is that they don't try to justify their sin. They don't try to say, well, it's not a sin itself, or deny the status of sin, because then it becomes a theological issue. It traverses into what we refer to as istihlal, right? Trying to make the haram halal. And that is a path to apostasy. That's a path to apostasy and rejecting Allah. Because on these sins, the Quran could not be more clear. And Allah could not be more clear when it comes to what is licit and illicit in sexual relations. So that's acts. When it comes to lifestyle and how a person is living, it's important for us to remind people that who you surround yourselves with is not a small thing. It's not a small thing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran tells us of people who have so much regret on the Day of Judgment because they took certain people as their friends. Ya laytani ittakhadhtu fulanan khalila. Woe to me that I took that person as a friend. That I took him as a friend. That's the type of remorse that people are going to have. And when you surround yourself with people who are defined by sin, who take pleasure in the sins that they do, and have pride in it, they invoke the terminology of pride when referring to the way that they're living. And you start adopting their way of speaking, their dress, their activities, you're going to become just like them. مَنْ تَشَبَّهَ بِقَوْمٍ فَهُوَ مِنْهُمْ. The Prophet ﷺ said, whoever imitates a people is from them. He is from them. And so it's bound to happen when these are your closest associates. And this is how you begin to internalize thought. You start taking on their attitudes socially, culturally, politically, eventually religiously too. You're going to think the way they do about God, about religion, and it's just a very, very quick route from there to disbelief. And so we have the issue of desires, actions, lifestyle, and then we have the final piece of this, which is perhaps the most critical or crucial part of it, which is the identity. And now what the identity does is it takes these desires, the sexual desires that a person has, and it elevates them into a place where now it defines the person. We're not simply talking a person who has fleeting sexual thoughts or ongoing sexual thoughts, but we're talking about a person who is defined by them such that he says, this is who I am, right? I am gay, I am lesbian, that's my orientation. And if you call that into question, you're now calling me into question. And this is why it becomes really difficult to have a coherent conversation on this topic with people. Because once you start talking about sins and actions and desires, and you start doing all of this, saying, no, you're denying my existence. And oftentimes that's what these people will say. They'll say, oh, you Muslims, isn't that queer Muslims exist? Right? They'll use these types of things. They'll say, oh, queer Muslims exist, whether you like it or not. They'll say, yeah, okay, Muslims exist who are sexually attracted to the same sex. But a Muslim's not defined by his desires, let alone sinful behavior that corresponds to those desires. A Muslim doesn't take pride or an identity in the sins that he does. That's fundamentally anathema to Islam itself. So if you think about, okay, a person is, let's say he has an ongoing inclination towards feeling, and it's an analogy, it's an imperfect one, but say someone feels constantly attracted to the opposite sex and committing zina. And he thinks about it often, and he fantasizes about it, and he says, you know what, this is such a core part of my being, given how much it goes through my mind, that I'm just going to be referred to as a zani. And I want you to refer to me as a zani Muslim. And if you're unwilling to do so, then you are denying who I am. We'd probably look at that person and say, that's a bad label for you to take on. That's a bad label for, if you've done zina, make tawbah. But to constantly call yourself the zani Muslim is a horrible way to think of yourself. And this isn't a label that Allah gave you. This isn't a label that you are anyone sticking a gun to your head and forcing you to take on. And so one of the most important things to do is to disabuse people from the types of identities they're internalizing and parading around socially. And it's important to reorient people towards God. Our fundamental identity as Muslims is that we're Muslim. مَنْ أَحْسَنُ قَوْلًا مِمَّنْ دَعَى إِلَى اللَّهِ. Who is better in speech than the one who calls to Allah? وَعَمِلَ صَالِحًا. And he does good works. وَقَالَ إِنَّنِي مِنَ الْمُسْلِمِينَ. And he says that I am from the Muslims. He says, I am from the Muslims. Allah says in the Quran, هُوَ سَمَّاكُمُ الْمُسْلِمِينَ. He named you Muslim. He named you Muslim. The most crucial aspect of our lives is that we are slaves of Allah. That's an honorific for us. And that we have submitted ourselves to Him. And any other identity that we take has to be qualified by Islam. Not the other way around. Not the other way around. And so if that teenager came and said, look, I think I'm gay, perhaps a good place to start would be, look, don't pigeonhole yourself with terms like that. You're a Muslim. That's the most, you're our brother, you're our sister in the community. You're a person who prays with us, we fast Ramadan together, you read the Quran. This is what's important about you, is that you're Muslim. Now, if you're telling me that you also are experiencing homosexual attractions, right, that's something that we can talk about, and we can provide you support and help, whatever you need. But the idea of who you are, that's not who you are. Right? You are as a Muslim, and you have to work a person back from that when it comes to the identity part of it. So that's homosexuality. Just remember, these four things are very, very important to sort of treat separately, because modern society treats them as a whole, and it just fronts the conversation to say, here's the gay community, what do you do with the gay community, what do you do with this, and it's at that point now, it's almost like we're making a referendum on human beings. And it's all about equality, it's all about justice, and that framing only makes sense if you have taken all of these different aspects, put them together, and treated them as if they're a cohesive whole that cannot be unbound. So that's homosexuality. On transgenderism itself is something that goes back in Western society decades. Now, historically, it was referred to as transsexualism. It was a loose classification of people who felt gender non-conforming. And there was a spectrum. Overwhelmingly, almost every case, especially like pre-90s, was one of adult males. Adult males. It was an adult male phenomenon. And there was a spectrum of men. And some of them, there was a subculture of men who would cross-dress. So transvestitism, something that happened. Sometimes, like, if you go back and watch older shows, you'll see that, like, become a punchline or things people crack jokes about. But cross-dressing, there was always a subculture around that, especially amongst some minority men, minority population of men. Jazakallah khair. But even on that, and I say it was a spectrum because you would have people who partake in that subculture who nevertheless in their day-to-day are living as men. And some of them were married and they had children, but they just had these impulses that they had to sort of get out of their system, and so they went and sort of moonlighted in these ways, sort of a part-time thing. You had others, a much, much smaller subset, that said, I have to transition, quote unquote, and go and get sex change surgeries and things like that. And there are a couple of popular stories in America where that happened, but nothing really that big until sort of the Bruce Jenner transition happens and suddenly it explodes into this big social phenomenon. So when you think about transgenderism, there's really three distinct groups that you need to analyze it through. I'll do the two least controversial groups. I'll do the least controversial group and then the two more controversial ones after that. The historical one of the adult male who transitions, right? And I'm just using the term transition because now everyone uses it, but basically says, hey, I feel like I'm a woman, and then he begins to take hormones and eventually get surgeries to cosmetically adjust himself to look like a woman. Historically speaking, the majority of these cases fell under an umbrella that scholars refer to as autogynephilia. So this is going to get a little explicit, so if you have kids in the room, just use your discretion, inshallah. But autogynephilia refers to a man's sexual desire to be a woman. And so it's almost like a fetish that's outgrown. It's an outgrown fetish. And there's actually a lot of scholarly literature on this. Almost every single case had to do with that, especially ones where it didn't become a big social celebrated thing. But historically, that's really what it had to do with. And the men who did it, they said they felt this huge urge and desire to embody women, to feel, to kind of experience what it's like to be a woman and to participate sexually with another partner as a female. So it's an outgrown fetish. Now, that represents different problems insofar as you think about how do we integrate these type of people into communities and stuff like that. That's a different question. But that's adult men. Almost exclusively, we're talking about gynophilic males. Women, especially like teenage to adult women, exceedingly rare. I mean, almost non-existent pre-2000s, and then suddenly now that transgenderism is a big social phenomenon, they are the fastest growing group of people who are transitioning. The numbers, I think, year over year right now are increasing by 300 to 400% in just about every single Western country. In fact, there's been a number of studies that have been on this, Lisa Littman and others. There's a good book by Abigail Schreier. It's called Irreversible Damage, that focuses on the growing number of women that are saying that they want to become men. And it's growing really fast. Now, they say for women, there are a couple of factors that play a big role. One is what they refer to as social contagion, which is just the influence of their surroundings, whether it's friends or other authority figures, people they look up to and others, playing an influential role in encouraging them to go down that road. So that tends to happen a lot, where you'll have one person who begins this, and then like her entire friend group does the same thing. Her entire friend group, it's like 5 or 6 people, all of them suddenly within the next few months, all begin their own transition paths. You also have other factors that intersect this, especially for women. So body image issues, which women experience at a much higher rate, especially in societies like ours, social alienation, the type of difficulties women go through when they begin to mature, and the feeling of being an outsider. There's a lot that seems to intersect with this issue. and it takes advantage of certain female vulnerabilities, and when those happen, this becomes almost an outlet. They are also the highest number of detransitioners. So the number of people who start going through hormone therapy and then suddenly at some point realize it was a mistake, have regret, they start to detransition, but at that point, certain physiological features have changed so drastically that it becomes difficult for them to go back fully to even appearing and sounding and looking like women. So that's what they refer to as rapid onset gender dysphoria. That's the majority of cases there. The most controversial category now are children. And the children category, that's the one that's the scariest, because you have very, very aggressive political efforts that are being done to almost encourage gender transitioning among children. Firstly, there is a very low bar or threshold for determining what counts as a child that may in fact be non-conforming. Children themselves are more volatile socially anyways, right? And so if you have a young son who, I don't know, wears his mother's hijab for salah, that doesn't make him a girl, right? But in sort of modern society, they'd say, look, that may be something worth exploring if he keeps doing that. Like these are the types of thoughts. It doesn't take much. If you read a lot of the guidelines, sometimes it's very small. In fact, the woman, I can't remember her name, but she's the head of the pediatric gender clinic in San Francisco, at the Children's Hospital in San Francisco. And she said that if you have a toddler who can barely speak, but the toddler's a girl, and she says, I'm a boy, that could be suggestive of that child at that age being transgender. And she's given like an entire presentation on this type of stuff. And so it can get really insane when people talk about the thresholds here and just how little needs to happen. What most people seem to encourage, especially in sort of like the pro-T camp, is that for children, it's important to give them the opportunity to explore via what they refer to as social transitioning. So social transitioning involves no medicine, and so they say it's harmless. And we'll use a Muslim example here. If you have a child named Ahmed in school, they'd say, let's let Ahmed explore what it means to be a woman one day a week. And on that day, let's say every Monday, Ahmed for our class is going to be Fatima. And we're going to have clothes that Ahmed can wear to look like maybe an abaya or something. He's just going to have female clothes that day, and he shows up at school, he's going to change, and he's going to dress like that. And we're all going to refer to him by Fatima. And that we'll call that his Fatima day. And at the end of the week, we'll see whether he likes it. And we'll do that for a month maybe. And at the end of the month, we'll say, hey, do you really enjoy your Fatima? And on that day, everyone's treating him special and being extra nice to him and this and that. And he says, yeah, that's like the funnest day of the week for me. And so then we'll push it up to 2 days and 3 days and 4 days. And that way we're giving him time to grow into it so that we can make sure it's something that's really for him. And if in fact he finds that this is who he really wants to be, then we know who he really is, because he can self-determine his own outcome. As parents, our responsibility is just to accommodate this process and to give him the context to explore that outcome, instead of prematurely saying, no, you're Ahmed. You're Ahmed, you're a Muslim boy. Like you, that type of thing is looked at as being very oppressive. Because, it's not harming you, but it could harm him. It could harm him, not allowing him to explore that more freely. And so social transitioning is a huge, huge thing. And there are many guidelines that have been produced by LGBT organizations for schools to incorporate social transitioning into public institutions. The idea is that, and one of the things that they're quite explicit about, which is what makes what Glenn Youngkin did significant, is that most of these guidelines spell out clearly that parents have no legal obligation to tell parents. And morally, it's probably better not to. And they'll spell that out. They'll say, because you don't know how the parent's going to respond. And if the parent responds negatively, now that could be a trauma that the kid is going to live with for the rest of his or her life. And so the pressure is squarely on administrators and teachers to encourage and accommodate this process and to refrain from informing parents lest those parents overreact because they're so bigoted and hateful and all the rest. So that's the social transitioning framework. And there's a big push for social transitioning amongst children, especially by LGBT advocates. This is also partially why things like Drag Queen Story Hour happen. The idea is that we want kids to see that this is nothing to be scared of. It can be fun. It's something that they can interact with. It's something that they can enjoy being around. There's a big, big program to destigmatize all of this and to make it appear normal. And so childhood transgenderism is really, really controversial, partly because of the social transitioning element, but it's also controversial because there are laws now at the state level that are being introduced in different states. So this has happened in California, the state of Washington, the other states, Illinois, New Jersey. Basically every left-leaning state now has laws that are being deliberated to lower the age of consent for medically transitioning. And so a kid who is 14 or 13, does he or she need his or her parents' approval to begin a regimen of hormone therapy and to start getting cross-sex hormones? Do they need parental permission to move beyond that? What do they need parental sign-off? At what age is the limit? So there's a big push to lower the limit and to lower it as far as it can go. I think most states it's still 18, but even 18, I mean, depending on different situations, it's quite low. And so, for instance, recently I met a sister in Maryland, a single mother. I don't know what country she's from. She's from an African country. She moved here, immigrated here. Allah make things easy for her. Her daughter is autistic, in a severe case of autism, and her daughter's 19. And she's just a single mother, and this is her only kid. And her daughter now, because of her daughter's therapist said she needs to go through hormone therapy, is now started hormone therapy. She's now receiving cross-sex hormones. And the mother was in tears telling me, I can't do anything about it. She said she's 19. And, you know, it's almost like she's been coached into saying all these very crazy things to me. And that's her life. She doesn't live with anyone else. Right? That's her one kid. And she's terrified that this girl's just going to leave the house and move out. And, you know, she has all these struggles and problems. And it's very, very complex, these situations when they arise. But you do have this effort to now lower the age, which is a big push that's going on at the policy level. And certain states have already passed legislation to lower the age. So with kids, this is a big controversial area. The other reason it's controversial is that historically, children who exhibited even really severe forms of, let's say, gender non-conforming impulses, usually regularized in over 95% of the cases. If they were just left alone. If they were just left alone, they just kind of went back to being, it was just a phase in their life. But now, what the social transitioning movement and everything else does is it sort of solidifies for them at a very young age this new gender identity, quote unquote, which they then have to wrestle with for Allah knows how many years, and introduces so much dysfunction in their lives. All of this is really, really complicated. And it's more complicated for other reasons. One is that most of the cases that you guys see on TV are of celebrities who have a lot of money. And those people can afford to go through really extensive plastic surgery and cosmetic alterations to look more passable as the opposite sex. Most people can't afford that much work. So most people who go through all of this end up looking very strange and don't socially fit in anywhere. They don't socially fit in anywhere, which can exacerbate a lot of their anxieties, their depression, their trauma. none of this actually seems to meaningfully reduce their suicidal ideation or inclination towards suicide. You do have situations now, and this is what we're seeing in the Muslim community, where you have adult men who have gone through this, are not being accepted as women, and are now interested in becoming Muslim because they see becoming Muslim as a way for them to be an accepted female, because they can wear niqab, and who's going to know, right? Like when you're wearing niqab, you're not identifiably, like if you're not as passing, it's okay. And so we've had emails that have come to different masjids where someone say, I'm interested in becoming Muslim and wearing a niqab. And this person doesn't know anything about Tawheed, the Prophet ﷺ, Quran, anything. He doesn't know anything about, but what he wants to do is he says, hey, look, I'm a transgender woman, right? And I want to become Muslim and start wearing niqab and and he said, I want to be a demurred Muslim woman and just be like, with the other sisters. And it's really scary. You get these really strange emails and you don't want to discourage someone from becoming Muslim, but at the same time, this is now a person who's trying to resolve his psychosocial problems through niqab and being in Muslim spaces with other women. And now you have to decide what you're going to do about that. You have to decide what you're going to do about that. So there are some, and by the way, the number of people doing that is increasing as well. So we're seeing more and more communities getting hit with those types of requests. So all in all, those are just some introductory remarks, inshallah. Not to freak everyone out about this, but this is really what's happening, right? So, yeah. Allah mustan, Allah protect us, man. So, and anyways, we could do Q&A, inshallah, and talk these things out. I'll say, look, I've done a couple of these. We did it in like Maryland masjids and stuff, and it's wild. I mean, especially if you do these sessions with teens or youth, it's tough now. It's very tough. I remember I was talking to the youth group at the Islamic Society of Baltimore, and there was a girl, she must have been 7 or 8 years old, and she told me during Q&A, she said, I think I'm a lesbian because I like girls. And she's young. I mean, what she means by like girls, she just like, that's all of her friends. But just the idea that someone that young would start developing that sense of self and self-conception, and that's how she's viewing things, it just tells you how far much of this has moved. And even outside of schools now, if you look at libraries, if you look at the way that the media, movies, TV, it's become so aggressive that it's a difficult, ideally we wouldn't have to talk about an issue like this. We really wouldn't. But it's virtually unavoidable now. It's virtually unavoidable. So Allah protect us. I think there's a lot of work that we have to do as Muslims to develop literature and material to help counteract a lot of this, as well as affirm our own socio-familial ethics. Because I think Allah knows that's the only way to give ourselves a good shot. So Allah knows best. So I guess we can do some Q&A and maybe talk about these things with the group.
So inshallah, I'm going to have Ramiz moderate. He's going to put a time limit on everyone. So if you go too long, he will stop you. I didn't want to do that because it will make me look mean. So I'm just going to pass it to him.
Okay, so we'll just do questions. I'm going to have questions. Raise your hand. Keep it short, inshallah. Yes. Oh, Rohani, you're going to have to come over here. Actually, let me take the mic over there.
How to be kind of careful about the abuse and sympathy with one who is being abused, and which does not mean you are sympathizing with him, and you are saying that we have to train ourselves. I cannot see how can I train myself, and how can I make this big differentiation if he is doing something bad, which we don't accept at all as Muslims. What we can do, how to do that.
Sure.
The other question for Brother Mubin, now all what you talk, it comes back to when we speak of state laws, how can we do alliances with our entities so that we can convince the legislatures to put certain barriers or certain limits on how far, for example, the libraries can put books in the shelves. How can the teachers, how far? The other day I was walking, just walking, and I saw a KG place. All the kids are wearing these rainbow clothes.
So as far as the sympathy goes, I think it's important. Maybe I can give a conceptual idea of what that looks like. I'll give you two scenarios. Your neighbor comes and knocks on your door. You know your neighbor is gay, and they're crying. What would you do? Would you say, go back home? I'm just asking. What's the matter, right? And that's the human part. You'd say, what's the matter? They say, my father, I told him I'm gay, and now he's abusing me. He's physically abusing me. Our job is to serve as a gateway. You'd be like, okay, hey, listen, you might want to contact the authorities, because again, abuse is not something that's tolerated. Am I supporting his homosexuality? No. I am supporting the fact that he shouldn't be abused. So this is how, treating someone as a human, that is how we do that, and that's how we deal with that. I'll give you a second scenario. I had a trans person actually come to my office, a male who transitioned to female. This person said to me, he said, I transitioned to female, and like Mubin was saying, it wasn't a particularly successful transition. Like, it was very clearly male. And he was ostracized by the community. And he said, now that I'm in the trans community, I converted to Islam, and now they don't talk to me either. There is a sense of sympathy that's there. There are people who are going through these problems and through these issues. I don't support the decision of the neighbor of being homosexual, performing homosexual acts. I also don't support the decision of this person. But now that this has happened, how do we deal with it? We have to show sympathy. We have to. And again, there's a difference between showing sympathy with the situation versus showing sympathy with the action. I'm sorry? Sure. Sympathy that the person is ostracized. Yeah, here, putting myself in a situation where I didn't transition, but I come to my community, and my community says, we don't want anything to do with you. So I turn away from the community and I go home. And I go home and my family says, I don't want anything to do with you. And like I said, we can sympathize with being ostracized and being turned away and being hurt, but I'm not sympathizing with the fact that this person transitioned. I don't agree. I fundamentally disagree with it. I'm sorry? It depends on what the problem is. Now, can I help that person be accepted? No. Right? That's not something I can help with, but at least I can sympathize. That's all I can do.
Bismillah. I'll just add to that. Obviously, not everyone deserves your sympathy, right? I mean, there are going to be people who, one, try to weaponize this idea of, you being compassionate to them for justifying anything that they do. And people being injured doesn't allow them to do or act in any way they want. You have the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ where one time there was a woman and she was crying over a grave and she was wailing. And the Prophet ﷺ told her to have sabr. And she lashed out the Prophet ﷺ. And he left her, but he didn't approve that behavior. And she came later because someone told her who he was, and he told her, as-sabr inda sadmat al-ula. Right, the famous hadith of Prophet ﷺ, that patience happens at the first strike of calamity. On that situation, he was rectifying her behavior at a time that was difficult for her. Right? It was difficult for her because she's standing over this grave, she's crying, she's lost somebody, and the Prophet ﷺ still told her what was right. Right? He wasn't doing so in a way that was demeaning or disparaging, but nevertheless, he was reminding. And some people, right, they'll use this idea to justify any behavior or action that they're doing. You say, no, like, okay, I can be sympathetic to anything that you've had in terms of trauma or problem, but right is right and wrong is wrong. In addition to that, there are certain people who have open enmity, really, like just open enmity towards people of religion. And I think to people like that, khalas, like, you don't have to love those people. Right? Al-hub lillah wal-bughd lillah. You love for Allah's sake, you hate for Allah's sake. And so you hate the actions that they do. And some of these people, like, okay, you know what? Like, you're not obligated to love some of these people, honestly. So Allah knows best. On the second part, in terms of what we can do, I think you said, like, what we can do. It depends on the institution, right? So I think that legislatively, Muslims can get involved and become active. I know that the Sheikh Farhan and Saif has mentioned the WhatsApp group where people are trying to mobilize and gather and organize, especially at the public school level. We need Muslims who are more engaged at different levels to be addressing this socially, because at a minimum, in a society like ours, we need public accommodations for people who care about religion. And so doctors who don't want to prescribe hormone therapies or conduct sex change surgeries. Therapists who want the freedom to perform therapy without affirming or encouraging this. You have many people who are vulnerable right now in their professional lives because of the way that this is getting pushed. And you need to carve out space where there are at least legal exemptions for people of faith such that they can practice and live their faith publicly without having this, become something where now their jobs and livelihood is being jeopardized. Likewise with teachers in the public schools. So, Montgomery County, what they're going through right now, there's a Muslim woman, I remember this was a few months ago, who told me she was very worried about the way that the county was going to force her to teach LGBT. And she asked me what to do, and I said, what do you think you should do? She said, I think I should leave my job. I said, say Bismillah, make istikhara, and Allah will find you a better way. I said, there are Islamic schools that need teachers. Like, if you're going to be in a position where you suddenly have to teach LGBT and the school's not giving you a choice, you can't be in that position, right? You have to make sacrifice for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, she shouldn't have had to do that, right? In a public school system, ideally that shouldn't be required. But at this point, right, it's still an ongoing fight. The school year is going to happen. She's very uncomfortable with the way that school system is growing and aggressive. And alhamdulillah, she found another job within Islamic school. But this is real. Like, you have public school teachers, you have people in corporate settings, now increasingly in different companies that are pressuring employees into participating in pride events. These are all things that we need to make sure that at a minimum people have exemptions from, that they're not coerced into participating in all of this. So I think that's sort of the legal political work that we can do. There are certain things that I think we just have to recognize are, there's a lot of limitations to what we can do. We're probably not going to be able to change Hollywood and what movies or TV shows they're making. Even with public schools, even if you win some of these debates at the public school level, most teachers that sign up to be teachers in public school settings are young, idealistic liberals. Not all, but many. Many are. And so even if you win, a course not being taught or having the ability to opt out of some of these classes, you're going to have teachers in these settings that are extremely pro-LGBT, extremely pro-LGBT. And what we're seeing now with some of these debates on the ground is we're hearing what these teachers actually think about Islam and what they think about Muslims. And you have to ask yourself, am I going to raise my kids with these people 7 hours a day, 5 days a week, for 10 months a year? Am I comfortable doing that with these people? Or am I going to try to invest more into alternatives like Islamic schools, develop more robust homeschooling systems and collectives? Like, those are places where you can exercise more creative control than public schooling, where you're going to be surrounded with people who don't share your values or beliefs and increasingly are becoming ideological on a lot of these issues. So I think in many spaces in this society, we just have to recognize there are certain limits. And as a result of those limits, we have to do more work ourselves to develop alternatives. So alternative media, literature, all of these things are things that, to a large extent, we're a bit behind on as Muslims. So, those are all things that I think can be helpful. But Allah knows best.
Okay, wait, I'm sorry. So can we just go back and forth with the question? No. So, anyone from the sister side? Yes.
I was just going to add, like, the other problem is we keep putting out fires, right? So it's not, we're not taking many of these proactive approaches. And what Ustad Mubin had mentioned in terms of there are spaces that we can actually be more assertive in those spaces versus putting out these fires. And sometimes we are successful in putting those fires out. We've had a couple of representatives who are running for positions who've come and they said, okay, within the DNC, they're actually pushing for certain policies, hiding the gender of the child in school, et cetera. They're like, what do we do? I was like, okay, well, we need to come up with practical ways of dealing with that. So one of the things is that I had spoken to the previous Secretary of Education and some of the candidates. I said, what are they telling you? They said, okay, well, this is something we need to encourage. And I told them, okay, can the school actually determine if abuse is happening? And they said, no. I said, whose job is that? They said, well, that's CPS, that's Child Protection Services. I said, okay, then make sure that there are referrals that are in place, because at least there's a legal recourse versus keeping it something that is hidden, right? The idea behind, like, how do we deal with these problems and issues? Bring them out into the sun, right? Even the sun is something that purifies garments, it purifies everything, it purifies ideas too. When things come out and they're more public, if more teachers are teaching, more parents are volunteering and involved in PTAs, more of these ideas will actually bubble and come to the surface. The other thing was about books. How do we control books? I said, okay, well, advocate for more oversight. If you have a parental advisory council and a religious advisory council, again, getting more people involved is the solution, but unfortunately, many times it's putting out fires versus actually taking a proactive approach.
Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah. So 2 quick questions. The first one is, are private schools, including Muslim schools, ever going to eventually be subject to also need to consider teaching that curriculum of LGBTQ? I don't know if that's just like a thing in America in general. And then second, in all the studies, do we know ultimately who is benefiting from this political momentum? Because it's clearly politics. It's not like who is benefiting from all of this?
So I have my own theories. In terms of your first question, like, can it be imposed? As of right now, no, right? You're allowed your own private curriculums in your own private space, and that's something that cannot be imposed on the private sector. The problem is that education is government, right? And I think one of the solutions of that is removing education from the government and allowing, localities to kind of govern their own school systems. And who's doing it? I have my own theories onto why it's happening and how come there's so much funding. I would believe it's the pharmaceutical companies because of the transition surgeries, because of the lifetime hormone replacement that's happening. So there's a big financial benefit in it for them, which is where I believe a lot of the funding is coming for. But like I said, that's just my personal take on it.
Yeah, so one of the things that I think we're fortunate for, at least at the moment in the United States, is that the US, when it comes to religious freedom exemptions and religious freedom commitments, is much stronger than other countries, much stronger than most other Western countries. So in general, it provides a lot of accommodations for private actors, especially religious ones. Now, there's a lot of room for us to exercise more autonomy within those confines, and I don't think Muslims have fully explored how much they can do within it. But nevertheless, that's there, and I think in the near term, one of the things Muslims have to try to fight for, at least domestically, is a maximalist interpretation of religious freedom, because these things are always contested. And I'll give you one sense of this. So I remember when Hillary Clinton was running for president, there was an op-ed that her campaign wrote, which instead of referring to freedom of religion, used the term freedom of worship. And that was very deliberate, because there are groups that look at religious freedom as something that has been interpreted and understood too broadly. And they say that what that constitutional guarantee really refers to is just your freedom to worship how you want, but it has not provided you the freedom to have whatever belief you want in the public square. And then the rest of society has to accommodate that. They say that's too broadly understood. And so that is something that is being deliberated in an ongoing basis. And there is a piece of legislation now that was just reintroduced in Congress called the Equality Act that is trying to qualify and constrain religious freedom further, especially against LGBT. So, these are things that are never stable, they're contested, they're debated, and I think as Muslims, we need to be more active in that debate, because right now, the only groups that are active in that debate within the Muslim community for the most part are people who are working against religious freedom, which is an unfortunate thing to say, but that's just where we are right now. Allah mustan. So I think that was the question on sort of private school. In terms of who benefits, I don't know. I mean, that's a good question. I think there's certain ways to look at this, since to say that there are groups that are very interested in seeing this play out. One of the things that I think is helpful, perhaps, to look at this entire LGBT program through the prism of is to view it as a religion. And I think if you view it as a religion, you'd say that, like a lot of religions, it has a missionary arm to it. And like all religions, people get very excited when they see more converts, when they see their movement grow. I think that is a huge motivation and driver for what's happening. People often say that the LGBT sort of, the proponents of it have overplayed their hand. Like, why do they keep pushing one issue, like drag queen story hour, why do they keep pushing forward? Allah knows. I mean, Allah describes them as musrifin, right? Like they can't stop. They just keep going and going and going. And I think that at least in the near term, because of the way our politics are, just how dysfunctional it is here, you're going to see things get increasingly polarized. And for a lot of people, this movement is viewed like they are in the midst of the civil rights movement in the 70s. I think many people view it the same way. And they see this as a historic moment in which, them not being part of it, them not being active, would be the equivalent of staying at home when Selma is going on, right? Like that's the way that this has been framed in the public eye, and I think how a lot of sort of well-meaning liberals view this topic, which is why it's so important for us, I think, to get back to sort of the whole identity, the four-component thing. It's so important to disentangle this topic from its civil rights framing. Because once you're in the civil rights framing, you've conceded a whole lot, and you've put yourself in a position where you cannot engage this topic in a way that treats it as something that can be subject to moral evaluation. You can't do that, because it would be like saying there's something wrong with someone who's black or Irish or whatever. Like that's just, you'd say, well, that's just who they are. How can you judge someone just for who they are? And when that's the way it's viewed, there's no debating it. But if you're able to say, no, this like whole identity component is very recent, and then there's this lifestyle component, there's actions, and there's desires, and we like all these things are independently treated, and what you're dealing with are people who have taken on you can actually, it becomes a much more coherent way of asserting moral disapproval, as opposed to the civil rights framing, which I think is sort of the dominant one today. But Allah knows best.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam. Abdul Razak, before your question, inshallah, if the sisters want to go ahead and start taking their food, please feel free to do so.
Brother, you start your topic about sin, committing sin, and LGBT committing sin. Because we don't hit them, we hit the sin they're doing. And we don't have a supervision in school. Our kids, they're attacking our kids now. They used to be don't ask, don't tell, now they come out very speed. And social media, if your children watching an educational video, they will set ad. How can we prevent that?
So, sorry, Sheikh, you said that there's like the sin, and then you said, how can we prevent what exactly? I'm sorry? Do you mind? How do we protect our children? Yes, so the brother's asking about sort of preventative measures. I think obviously reducing people's exposure or consumption of digital technologies is important. That's like an unpopular position with kids because they love digital technologies. But nevertheless, like it's important because they're very addictive mediums, and depending on the different spaces they participate in, they're going to become part of liberal social currents very quickly because social media is a really dysfunctional place where people argue and fight all day. And so that's something that I would say in general is just even for their own like psychosocial growth and personal health, it would be better for them not to be consumed with at all hours of the day, inshallah. There are other things that you can do at home. There are some technologies you can have that, like when it comes to internet use, put restrictions on different sites people can access, how long they can go on the internet, things like that. They sell technologies like that for parents and families. Beyond that, I think that there are certain things that we need to try to teach our children at a young age to get in the habit of, which are very uncommon today, like reading. People don't really read a lot today. And as a rule of thumb, if you get books or novels that predate 1998, you're probably not going to run into this issue, in maybe 97, I don't know, just around that range. If you just use that as a just rule of thumb, anything that's published before that, you're probably not going to hit this topic at all. And just because no one's thinking about that as a topic to, create an entire plot line around. And so I think reading helps. I think alternative media helps too. And so if you're able to find better media or screen shows, there are some websites like Common Sense Media. I will say, a good thing that's happened in the Muslim world is that you do have more and more shows and series that are being developed. Obviously, they're not in English. They're in Arabic usually or other languages. Turkish, these types of languages where you do have shows that are very Islamic and positive in terms of messaging and content. So perhaps those are the types of things that your kids can start consuming, but that also requires them to be a bit more invested in bilingual education. But yeah, those are some thoughts offhand, inshallah.
Okay, so we'll just take one more question from sister side, and then if you want to approach the speakers afterwards on your own, you can. Any questions from the sister side?
Yeah, just wanted to add a couple things to what Ustad Mubin was talking about. There are spiritual methods also that it's important to keep in mind. Making dua is something that is really extremely important, and there's no reason for us to ever minimize that. So making active dua for our children to be protected, and we ask Allah Subhanahu wa Taala to protect us and our families. And the second thing is having a good relationship with our kids, right? So we can put all of these protective measures in place, but if my child is not coming to me when they see something strange or they see something that is questionable, there's no way for me to really monitor those things, because at the end of the day, we can put all these protective measures in place, but there will be exposure at some point at some time, and it's more important for them to come to me and say, hey, Baba, I saw this and I don't really know how to process it, and they trust me enough where I can help them process some of those those things that they might have experienced, saw, or heard.
So I'm from Philadelphia, not from this area, and I grew up with a girl, and I ran into her as an adult, and I ran into her at the masjid. She had on a thobe, kufi, and everything. She had a wife. She transitioned. I didn't even know who she was. So she came to me, she gave me salam, so I'm looking, and she was like, it's Kiana. And I was like, I was so shocked. I didn't know how to handle that. So in that situation, was I supposed to let someone at the masjid know that she's praying on the brother's side? Was I supposed to give her some sort of advice? Or because I just honestly left it alone because it was so awkward. I couldn't wrap my head around it.
So Assalamu alaikum. So I used to live in Philly actually for a few years. So the sister asked the question about a friend she ran into many years later who has now transitioned, and I guess is living as a man and is married to a woman. So obviously that's not like a halal relationship to begin with. Allah musta'an. But in terms of what your responsibility is or duty is, I guess it's just a question of what opportunity you have. So if this is a person who reaches out to you where you feel like you still have a friendly relationship with, I think you can take that as an opportunity to perhaps develop rapport with this person and maybe talk to her about how she's living now, what she's doing. Maybe this isn't the introductory topic, but it becomes a topic alongside others where maybe you can reestablish and remind her, inshallah. In terms of the community itself, I mean, that's a tough question. I guess, how well do you know the community? If you do know people in the community, I think it would probably be prudent to tell somebody there, especially if this is like an active person in the community. I think you're better off at least letting, or maybe advising the friend directly, saying, look, hey, if you're going to go to the masjid option, you have to realize that gender norms are a really fundamental part of the Sharia. And so much of Islam pivots on the basis of gender, and transgenderism actually transgresses all of those norms. And so, being upfront with the masjid, I think, is an important part of your relationship with it, and maybe what the masjid can do and work with you to try to find a way for you to participate in the community that doesn't transgress those norms. Now, what that method is, Allah knows, but at least that's something where maybe what this person needs is some sort of reestablishing of a relationship with the community and other Muslims, and perhaps, inshallah, you can give her some nasiha along those lines. Allah knows best. I don't know if you have any other ideas, Sheikh Farhan.
Unfortunately, it is something that's very difficult, and like Mubin had mentioned, it's the best way to advise someone is if we have a relationship with them. It's, you can't just walk up to someone and tell them like, hey, what you're doing is wrong. That will turn them off immediately, and they will not be accepting of that advice. So whenever we do Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahy anil Munkar, it has to be in a way where that person is at least willing to receive it. Whether they reject it or not, obviously, is up to them. But you have to be in a position where they're going to be most willing to receive it. So, but it is something that is difficult. And it is something that I only foresee to grow, unfortunately. I don't see this problem going away anytime soon. So it is something that we're already dealing with. I know at least in the DC area, there are 4 transgender Muslims that I'm aware of, if not more. So it is a phenomenon that is here. And if you guys ever get the opportunity, there's actually a really good book called When Harry Became Sally, and it talks about a lot of people who transitioned, people who wanted to detransition. There are even cases in there very similar to the autism case. The girl had Down syndrome, and it's just they felt like in order to help cope, they would transition this person with complete surgery. It's just barbaric. It's completely barbaric, and it's atrocious. It's like, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect our families. I mean.
That was the last question.
For folks that are interested to stay engaged on this, we're actually working on a law right now in Virginia to make opt-in the main choice from 4th to 8th grade, and then opt-out after 8th grade. And the goal there is that the default is this is not taught to your kids from 4th to 8th grade, but it is an opt-out opportunity for you after 8th grade. So if you're interested on engaging on that, inshallah, and the person who has agreed to adopt this is the person who many of you here said not to vote for. This brother Saddam Salim has actually said that he'll be the sponsor to push for this bill, inshallah, after the community meeting. So if people are interested, sign up for the WhatsApp group, come see me, give me your emails, inshallah. We'll connect with you afterwards. And the last thing is there's actually a poll that just came out that's recent, not published, that even amongst the Democratic Party, there is a significant majority that say stop hitting me over the head with Islam, literally. And this is internal polling from the party. So.
And just a final reminder for those of you that registered for the program, it is $5 per person. So if you're paying cash, please put it in the donation box here, or you can register online. We would really appreciate it. And one of the reasons for that is because we want feedback for the program as well. And when you register, we can send you follow-up information and more even suggested reading material. I know a couple of people asked me for copies of the slides. That's something that I'm willing to share as well. But there's no way for us to follow up if you guys don't register. So please remember to do so. Jazakumullah khair.
Sorry, one more resource. So there's an organization online called the Sapience Institute, SAPIENCE. they're coming out with a course online which will be free by Dr. Carl Sharif Al-Tubji, Dr. Sharif Al-Tubji's course on this topic. It'll be 30 hours long, inshallah. It addresses this from a number of different angles. Highly, highly encourage everybody to take that up, inshallah, when it gets released. Probably coming out within the next month, so look out for that, inshallah. Sapiens Institute, Sapience. Just look at their online courses. Hopefully within the next 30 days, there will be a really good course on this topic. So, jazakumullah khair. Long time no see. How's it? It's been a very long time, man. How have you been? Where are you? I'm in there. You're here now. Came down. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Nice to meet you. But yeah, I was looking for a company. Because I was going to do it myself, but then I saw videos and it's very complicated. Apparently, like they walk, like their content hack, they're